I also think on the other side, it does force us to really give some thought in terms of how do we simplify the understanding of pay. And I think that's a really positive trend because for too long, pay for a lot of people has been this black box, that I just look at the number right at the end of my pay slip. And if that's okay, then I'm fine with whatever happened at the top.
Hello everyone and welcome to HR Hot Topics, in which we talk about some of the topics that we've read in the news in the past month. Today is a special episode because it's the end of the year. I'm Erik van Vulpen, with me is Dieter Veldsman, and let's dive right in. But before you do, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Today is a special episode. I'll tell you why, because it's the end of the year and both Dieter and myself will give you our highlights for 2022. But before we do, we want to start with something else, because last week we asked in the community, what is the moment that you're most proud of in 2022 as an HR professional? And we got some amazing comments. So what we want to do is we want to review some of those comments and give our perspective on what is happening in HR. And Dieter, I think you have the first comment for us.
Yes, Erik, I think there was a comment made by Tina in the community really around employee value proposition and employer brand. And she really mentioned that in 2022, they introduced a re-envisioned onboarding framework to support developing a culture of employee mobility as part of their rebranded employee value proposition. I think in 2022, such an exciting topic around what does the EVP and the employee experience look like? Where do you see that going in 2023?
We've spoken a lot about this, Dieter, the changing expectation between the employee and the employer, the changing psychological contract. And I think employers will become more and more conscious of what is that EVP that they put down for their workforce. If you work mainly with deskless workers, it might be certain benefits or perks. I'm thinking of Inca or IKEA allowing workers to buy products cheaper because, of the current cost of living crisis, but also the role that technology plays for setting your own times and essentially having more authority about your own time as a blue-collar worker. I think for white-collar workers, hybrid working is still very much in the picture. What is our policy going forward towards, working remotely or being in the office? And I think that is something that we haven't seen the last of that discussion yet, even though I had hoped that 2 years ago we could have already wrapped this up. I think for a lot of organizations, there's still that suspicion of, are you really in the office? Because then you're working. And if you're not in the office, how can we manage your performance? And I think organizations need to get really clear on that.
I think there has been a lot of talk this year around, I think, especially flexibility and freedom and what's the difference between the two. I agree. I think for certain types of work and the nature of work, I think organizations are getting to that stage where they've almost experimented enough so that we can put those principles in place on what things need to look like. Something that excited me was an example that I heard from a retailer that I spoke to recently, where for their frontline workers, what they've actually tried to do is to introduce a lot more choice around when you work. So according to your example, so they could schedule themselves by saying, I need to work 15 shifts during the course of the month, but when I schedule my shifts is actually, up to me. And they kind of balance the weighting of, for the shifts that nobody wanted to work at the beginning of the day, you get paid a little bit more per shift, etc. And I think that's such a clever way of thinking about employee experience and value proposition in really alignment to the nature and the type of the work that happens in that particular moment. And I hope we see a lot more of that. On that note, I think there's also some movements around pay transparency that you've read in the community.
We had some amazing work done in that field, yeah. So we had Naomi saying, I'm very proud to have guided a team to rework job descriptions to align with the organization's new vision and digital transformation strategy. And also Abdul Jabbar saying, as an HR leader, I've completed a new performance appraisal system. And as the head of the job evaluation team, I've finished evaluating our jobs, and that will result in a new salary system. And these comments make me excited because this is a quintessential HR to me. It's about pay. How do we compensate? How do we do that in a fair way? And I think what's interesting is that we see on the one hand, jobs or careers, I should say, being more and more mosaic, where you have different skills and different skill sets, or pixelated is also one of those beautiful words to describe it, which for the individual means that you need to build different skills, but also from an organizational perspective, understand what are the skills that you have in your organization. And to your point, Dieter, also pay transparency. And pay transparency, we've seen a lot of regulation in New York, in California, in different places. And I'm curious, Dieter, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing that we're now transparent about what your salary is and everyone can just see that.
I think it's a really good thing, Erik. I think it's something that has been coming along in a conversation over the past couple of years around why are we not transparent? And I think a lot of legislation, as you've mentioned, has been introduced. I'm excited about the fact that a lot of companies actually started to disclose and be a lot more transparent even before the legislation came into place. I do want to caution, though, as much as I believe in the principle of pay transparency, something that I do worry about, and there's been quite a bit of conversation about that in the news currently, is just have we educated managers and employees enough leading up to transparency? Because I think that's still the component around people not necessarily understanding pay, and more transparency might lead towards a lot of uncomfortable conversations that kind of raises conflict as opposed to actually driving consensus and people being feeling like they're being treated fairly.
Yeah, and I also have the feeling that a lot of organizations are still struggling with it, because I try to stay off of TikTok, but I saw a TikTok video of people in New York, reporting salaries, and it was the chief marketing officer was earning anywhere between 50K and 600K, and they had another role, an SVP, was between 40K and 200K, and those were the salary bands, and they're making fun of these bands. So how are we specific on the salary expectations without excluding the people that we actually want to hire?
I also think on the other side, it does force us to really give some thought in terms of how do we simplify the understanding of pay.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really positive trend, because for too long, pay for a lot of people has been this black box, that I just look at the number right at the end of my pay slip. And if that's okay, then I'm fine with whatever happened at the top. And I think it is going to force us a lot more, especially your earlier comment around when we start paying for skills or looking at things like internal marketplaces or different types of remuneration. That's exciting, because I think that's really going to raise the bar for us in terms of how do we get people on board. And the thing I worry about a little that I want to throw back to you is, do you think managers are equipped to have these conversations? Because surely that's where I'll go if I'm not happy and I realize that I'm being paid differently than somebody else that I think is doing the same job.
I think managers will have to deal with these conversations because, they are having them today. And I think it boils down to what is the system that you have in the organization, and do you have clarity about the roles that you have, the responsibilities that the people in those roles have, and then the way they are paid. I think one of the fascinating statistics, and this is published by Harvard Business School, an article by Associate Professor Cullen, and she found out through a quantitative analysis that if you implement pay transparency in an organization, average pay goes down by 2%. Actually for the employer. And it mostly has to do because essentially most of the peaks will start to disappear. So you get a leveling of salaries, and because those peaks start to disappear, average salaries will actually go down a little bit. So it might actually also be a good thing for employers.
I think it's definitely, I think there's a lot of benefits for employers as well around, not just from a policy point of view, but I think really in terms of understanding what does competitive pay look like in the market. I think for a very long period of time, it's been the sources of truth in the pay world has relied heavily on salary surveys without actually being able to understand how is that fluctuating and changing over time. And I hope that this changes that so that we can make a lot more informed decisions around workforce planning and demand planning and how we're really going to retain talent.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's salary surveys from at least a year ago. So, we're moving towards a period with higher inflation. What does that do with your salaries? Because if you're benchmarking towards a year ago, there might actually be quite a big gap there. And if everyone is benchmarking towards the same numbers, you also, don't get a representation of what the real value of the role is. And I think especially if we start talking about some of the rare skills that we have in the organization, certain digital skills, skills like AI, do we really give them the value that they deserve? I don't know. And I think a lot of us don't know how to do that properly.
I agree, Erik. And I think it's good that, there's a lot of HR practices that we tend to think about in terms of 12-month cycles, right? So I think there's going to be quite a few things that we are starting to say, we need to look at these things a lot more frequently. We need to make sure that we adapt and are a lot more agile in our responses to the market and what's happening there. And I think pay transparency is going to force that conversation a bit. And I think that's a good thing for us in general.
Definitely. There's still a lot of work to do, but there's also some big things, some big feats that we can celebrate as an HR community. And Dieter, I'm curious, what is the number one thing that stood out to you when you look back at 2022?
Erik, I think what I want to mention as looking back at 2022 is really something that stood out for me is how the HR community, especially around the tech layoffs, really pulled together. I think something we've been struggling with is HR at times can be extremely internally focused. You forget that there's a broader community beyond your own organization. This notion around the fact that HR is stronger together, that HR can pull together and we can actually help each other across different industries. I think for me, key highlight of 2022.
For me, it's something similar actually, of HR professionals pulling together. And for me, that was just after the war in Ukraine broke. We saw some amazing initiatives of HR professionals supporting people, refugees coming from Ukraine. And most notably, I think, is the HR for Ukraine Notion board that was put together by Sergio Carreda and numerous other HR leaders and professionals. Really a one-stop place for all kinds of resources and help for people, refugees coming from Ukraine. So I think that those are really heartwarming ways where we really see the HR community stepping up. And I think as HR professionals, we love to help. If you're able to find your community, find your tribe, and see some of those amazing stories that have been shared also at the AIHR community, I think that is heartwarming, and I think that is very hopeful towards the future.
I think, looking back at the year, I think the narrative around HR has definitely changed. If we think about the early 1990s, I think this whole debate around fighting for the existence of HR, fighting for the seat around the table, I really feel the past 2 years or so, that narrative has started to shift a lot in terms of, HR really stepping into the value that we add to business. And I think that's a very positive narrative, and inspires me to say, but what's next? What comes after this year? What is on the horizon? And if ever there was an opportunity for HR, I think, to grasp the future, that has to be now. And I think that's really going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And to your point, no HR professional can do that alone. We need to do that through community. And I'm continuously inspired when I read our own community's comments and the great work that they are busy with. We need to celebrate that a lot more. And I hope we are able to do that next year.
Absolutely agree. I think 2023 will be an amazing and exciting year to come. That's it from our side for this year, Dieter.
Can't believe it's the end, Erik. I think thank you very much. Love doing the hot topics with you.
Likewise, and we hope to see you all in 2023. If you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel.